Conclusions are a part of essays that a lot of students struggle with. In fact, there were, I would say, at least a third of all of my students this semester indicated that they wanted to work on conclusions based on how they did on the first essay. So it was a goal for a lot of you. So this diagram comes from Laura Randazzo. She has a lot of videos out there on YouTube about writing, and she's awesome. But I thought that maybe this diagram might be helpful for you guys too. And I'm also going to walk you through a few student examples from last time so you can kind of see this in action. Some of them were doing some of these things, maybe with realizing it, maybe not, I don't know. But anyway, I'm going to show you a few examples of some pretty masterful conclusions today. So first off, what you want to do is, if you notice, this triangle is kind of opposite from this triangle, right? So your conclusion and your introduction, they kind of mirror each other in certain ways. So with an introduction, you start out broad, and then you narrow down to this thesis statement of what you're really going to focus your essay on. With a conclusion, you start out narrow, so you start out with the thesis, but you're using fresh words, okay? And what that means is that you need to restate it in such a way where it doesn't sound exactly like the way you phrased it in the introduction. Laura Randazzo has this structure over here that you can consider using, okay? So her tip for students is when one considers, and then this is kind of like your reason why number one, and reason why number two, and maybe reason why number three, it's clear that blah, 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 okay? And then you'd state your opinion again. So it's kind of like a flipped thesis statement if you think of it that way, which is kind of cool. Then you have 1 to 2 sentences on why this matters. So I'm sure a lot of you guys have heard about conclusions and so what. Now a conclusion is supposed to answer so what? Why do we care? Why do we read this whole essay? That kind of stuff. So you want to explain the bigger reason why we should care. So in the case of Confederate monuments, why do we care? Why do we care if these things are still in existence? Why do we care if, you know, we're still talking about the Civil War and some of these remnants from the past that are left behind? What's the big deal anyway? That's what you want to be answering in your conclusion. And then your final sentence here, your last sentence, is something where you want to leave your reader with some kind of a lingering thought, okay? One student who I even asked in class the other day, I said, so you used a quote that was really awesome at the end of your conclusion. Why did you do that? And he said it exactly. He said, because I wanted to leave some kind of a lingering thought with my reader, and I thought this would be a good way to do that. That is one thing that you can do. As long as you haven't used a quote as your hook, you can potentially use one to kind of leave us with something to think about here. Okay, so let's take a look at a couple of student examples from our last EBQ. And in fact, I'm going to go ahead and enlarge this real quick to make sure that we can see these examples. Okay, so what you want to do is you want to notice what these students are doing or using to draw their essay to a satisfying close. Just be thinking about, what do you learn from these students' conclusions? And then how might you apply this to your conclusion that you're writing on Confederate monuments? Okay, so let's take a look at this first one here. So in this first one, this is the students that I was just talking about. Basically what he's doing here is he's got this part: these books written by actual slaves offer so much more than a textbook ever could, for they draw attention to the emotional truths of slavery. Constant whipping, separation, and sexual assault all had devastating effects on slaves' minds, but the true feelings of slaves could never have been told if it weren't for these direct accounts from escaped slaves. So if you notice here, what I'm kind of detecting is this is his thesis that is rephrased, all right? He's talking about the constant whippings, the separations that occurred, sexual assault, how all of these things together had devastating effects on slaves' minds, okay? So that to me feels like a thesis statement that's been restated here. It's great. Then he's talking about the fact that you've got these narratives. If it weren't for these direct accounts, that we wouldn't know these things, right? These are the truths that come out when we're actually able to encounter primary sources, which is important. Okay. And then he mentions Frederick Douglass, which I'm sure he used Frederick Douglass in his essay. All right. Frederick Douglass had to struggle and face the most horrifying experiences and still find hope. And then here's a great so what. Hope was the #1 factor that led to the final end of slavery. And then he's got this amazing quote that ties into that. The soul that is within me, no man can degrade. Now, isn't that awesome for a final lingering thought for us? Right? Like, wow. Okay. Can't take that away, right? Lovely. Okay, so let's move on to our second conclusion example here. Let's see what this student did. Now, in this one, whoopsie, we've got the restatement of the thesis again. We've got truths are revealed when primary sources can tell the stories. The truths that were described were greatly moving, was the treatment of slaves, and the horrors they must endure were so beyond painful that it is possible to understand through our minds. And then this student decided to recap on the narratives that they chose to use. Harriet Jacobson, Equiano, Solomon Northrop. Okay? It is demonstrated that the free slave still endured horrific treatment from the white man, and comparing a free man's life and a slave's, you can find a large common factor of racism. So there's kind of the big idea, right? The claim that America's morals and ideas have changed from religious beliefs to human archetypes and cruelty can be looked upon through the middle passage with Equiano and the treatment that we find so cruel today. And then here is the lingering thought. Slave narratives are a key factor in understanding what our ancestors caused and how we can change the effects of today. Ooh, that's nice. See, they've got a then and now kind of comparison that they're making here. That's pretty awesome. So that's maybe something that you guys could do too, right? With Confederate monuments, then and now. Why were they put up then? Why were they a big deal then? Why are they a big deal today? And then I've got one more for you to look at. Now this one's a little bit longer, so I'm going to go ahead and put this down on one page so we can look at it together here. So this is the third one. Slavery today is known as a horrific act that has slowly been forgotten. People's stories and struggles have been buried in our past. A slave's stories share with us their blood, sweat, and tears and allow us to remember them, despite the fact that sometimes their hardship is forgotten. Slave narratives bring out the truth about slavery and remind us about the horrors that happened less than 200 years ago, whose effects we still see today. The slaves' quotes, letters, and books about themselves share with us their story and remind us of one of the worst periods of our history. So this student right here, it seems like, is talking a little bit about the so what, or the bigger reason, right? And then a lot of this also feels like maybe she's recapping some of the major points from her essay. Slaves were treated as nothing but property, and there was no end to the cruelty of slaveholders and buyers. So this feels like a reason why to me, or maybe a claim that she was making in her essay. Slavery was incredibly horrific and dehumanizing, and it had to be in order to continue the practice. So that again feels like another point or another claim she was making in her essay. And we can still see the effects of slavery on freed slaves and on our nation, which can be reflected throughout our history. So she's doing a great job of recapping on some major points here. Now here's a big so what. They remind us, these slave narratives, they remind us of a period in history which most of us would like to forget, and they help us to remember and learn about slavery, so we try to make sure that doesn't happen again. They help us to remember the people who suffered and the people who did something about it to try to help a minority of people for years to come. So that's, again, a nice lingering thought that she's got going on here, right? Her so what, and then a lingering thought to leave us with. So as you guys are doing your conclusion, be thinking about this model and try it out. Try to restate your thesis. You can use this formula over here if you like. Why not? Try it. See how it sounds. Then have a few sentences that talk about the bigger issue here of why we should really care. recap a little bit on what you talked about in your paper. And then we have a lingering thought. See if you can come up with some kind of a final statement that's kind of like one of those mic drop moments. See if you can do that.